My brother banned me from his wedding because I'm an Undertaker and it's embarrassing for his in-laws, even though that same job paid for his fancy college. So I showed up with something that made him freeze. Hey, Reddit. So my brother banned me from his wedding because my job as a funeral director is apparently too embarrassing for his future in-laws. This is the same job that paid for his fancy college education. The same job that kept him fed and clothed when our parents died. But sure, let's pretend I work at a slaughterhouse or something. Anyway, I showed up to that wedding with something that made him freeze in his tracks, and now he's blowing up my phone begging. Let me explain. I'm 34 years old, and I've been a funeral director for the past 12 years. Not an undertaker. That's what my brother calls it to make it sound creepier. I'm a licensed funeral director and embalmer who runs a pretty successful funeral home in Oregon. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, pays well, and helps families during their worst moments. I'm good at what I do, and I take pride in it. My brother Daniel is 28, 6 years younger than me. For most of his life, I've been more like a parent to him than a sibling. Our actual parents died in a car accident when I was 22 and he was 16. No life insurance beyond what covered the funeral costs. No college fund. No safety net. Just 2 kids, a mortgage on a house that was underwater, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what came next. I just finished my mortuary science degree and was working as an apprentice funeral director when it happened. The irony wasn't lost on me. I just learned how to prepare bodies for burial, and then I had to help plan services for my own parents. That's a mindfuck I wouldn't wish on anyone. After the funeral, I had a choice to make. Daniel was a junior in high school with decent grades and dreams of going to college. He wanted to study business, maybe get his MBA eventually. But without our parents, that wasn't happening unless someone stepped up. We had an aunt in Florida who offered to take him in, but she made it clear there'd be no money for college. He'd be on his own after high school. So I made a decision that changed both our lives. I sold our parents' house, took a hit on it because of the market, but got enough to pay off the remaining mortgage and have a little left over. I found a small 2-bedroom apartment near my work, and I told Daniel he could live with me rent-free until he finished college. All he had to do was keep his grades up and help out around the apartment. For the next 2 years, while he finished high school, I worked 60-hour weeks at the funeral home. I took every shift I could get. Nights, weekends, holidays, didn't matter. Dead people don't care about your schedule, and grieving families need help around the clock. I'd come home exhausted, smelling like embalming fluid even after scrubbing my hands raw, and Daniel would be at the kitchen table doing homework or playing video games with his friends online. I made sure he had everything he needed. New clothes for school, money for the occasional movie or pizza with friends, a used car when he turned 17 so he could get to his part-time job at the mall. I even paid for his SAT prep course and all his college application fees. When he got accepted to Oregon State University with a partial academic scholarship, I was genuinely proud. The scholarship covered about 40% of his costs. I covered the rest. For 4 years, I paid Daniel's tuition, his room and board, his books, his meal plan, and sent him spending money every month. He didn't have to work during the school year. I told him to focus on his grades. During summers, he'd work part-time and keep whatever he earned. Meanwhile, I kept grinding away at the funeral home, taking on more responsibilities, eventually getting my own embalmer's license, and slowly saving up to buy my own funeral home someday. Did Daniel ever say thank you? Sure, kind of. In that vague way people thank someone for passing the salt. It was just expected that I'd take care of everything, because that's what big brothers do, right? He never really grasped the weight of what I was sacrificing for him, the relationships I didn't have time for, the hobbies I gave up, the nights I fell asleep at my desk because I'd worked a 16-hour day and still had to review casket inventory. Daniel graduated with his business degree and landed a decent job at a regional bank in Portland. Not amazing money, but solid. He moved out of my apartment and got his own place. We'd see each other for the occasional dinner or holiday. Our relationship was fine. Nothing deep, but not hostile either. He was busy building his career, I was busy running my business. That's just how life goes sometimes. About 3 years ago, I finally saved up enough to buy my own funeral home. Small operation, just me and 2 full-time staff members. But it was mine. I bought out a retiring funeral director who wanted to sell rather than close up shop. The building needed work, but I knew the bones were good. I spent the next year renovating, updating equipment, and building relationships in the community. Business grew steadily. Turns out when you treat grieving families with genuine compassion and don't try to upsell them on a solid gold casket they don't need, word spreads. I became known as the funeral director who actually gave a damn. My reviews online were overwhelmingly positive. People appreciated that I'd sit with them for as long as they needed, that I'd accommodate weird requests for services, that I never made them feel rushed or pressured. The money got better too. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. I bought a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, got a dog, started dating occasionally. Life was pretty good. The job still had its hard moments. You never really get used to embalming a kid or comforting parents who just lost their only child. But I'd made peace with it. This was my calling, even if I'd stumbled into it by necessity rather than passion. Daniel, meanwhile, had climbed his way up to a mid-level management position at his bank. He started dating this woman named Jennifer about 2 years ago. Jennifer came from money, the kind of old Portland money where your family has streets named after them. Her dad was some kind of commercial real estate guy. Her mom did. Honestly, I'm not sure what her mom did besides go to charity luncheons and judge people. You know the type. I met Jennifer exactly 3 times before the wedding drama started. First time was at a birthday dinner for Daniel. She seemed nice enough, if a little stiff. She asked what I did for work, and when I told her I was a funeral director, she did that thing where people's faces freeze for a second while they recalibrate how to respond. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, that must be so interesting." Translation: she thought it was creepy, but was too polite to say so. Second time was at Thanksgiving dinner at my place. I'd invited Daniel and Jennifer over along with a couple friends. Jennifer spent most of the evening talking about her family's vacation home in Bend and asking questions that felt like job interviews. How much did funeral directors make? Was it a growing industry? Did I ever think about doing something else? Every question had this underlying tone of, surely you can't actually want to do this for a living? Third time was when Daniel brought her by the funeral home because she'd always wanted to see where I worked. That's what she said anyway. I think Daniel put her up to it, trying to show her that my job wasn't that weird. I gave them a quick tour of the facilities, the arrangement rooms, the chapel, my office. I didn't take them into the prep room because that would have been inappropriate, and also because I had a body on the table, and she definitely didn't need to see that. Jennifer kept her smile plastered on the whole time, but I could see her discomfort. The way she wouldn't touch anything. How she kept her hands clasped in front of her like she was afraid of contamination. When we finished, she thanked me for the tour, and then immediately asked where the nearest restroom was, so she could wash her hands. Classy. After they left, I didn't hear from Daniel for about 2 weeks. When he finally called, it was to tell me he'd proposed, and Jennifer had said yes. I congratulated him, asked about the proposal, did all the appropriate brotherly things. He was excited, talking about their plans for a spring wedding at some fancy vineyard outside Portland. I told him I was happy for him and looked forward to being there. Things went quiet for a few months. Daniel and Jennifer were busy with wedding planning, and I was busy running my business. I figured I'd hear from him when they needed to finalize details about the ceremony. Maybe I'd be asked to do a reading or make a toast. Standard wedding stuff. Then, one Sunday afternoon, Daniel called and asked if he could come over. Said he needed to talk to me about something important. His tone was weird, kind of formal and stiff, like he was rehearsing what to say. I told him to come by, figuring maybe he wanted me to be his best man or needed to borrow money for the wedding. Both would have been fine by me. He showed up an hour later looking uncomfortable as hell. Kept shifting his weight from foot to foot on my porch before I invited him in. We sat in my living room, and I waited for him to explain what was going on. He spent a solid 5 minutes making small talk about the weather and asking about my dog before I finally cut him off. I asked him what he actually wanted to talk about. He took a deep breath and then hit me with it. Jennifer's parents were very traditional, he said. They had certain expectations about the wedding and who would be there. They were concerned about appearances. They wanted everything to be perfect. I waited. He kept dancing around whatever he actually wanted to say. Finally, I just asked him directly what the problem was. He looked at his hands and mumbled something I couldn't hear. I asked him to repeat it. He took another breath and said that Jennifer's parents were uncomfortable with me being at the wedding because of my profession. They thought it might upset some of their guests. They'd asked Daniel to uninvite me. I sat there for a second, making sure I'd heard him right. Then I asked him if he was seriously telling me that I wasn't invited to my own brother's wedding because I'm a funeral director. He immediately started backtracking, saying it wasn't his idea, that he'd tried to talk them out of it, that he felt terrible about it. But Jennifer's parents were paying for the wedding, and they'd threatened to pull their funding if I showed up. The way he said it, like this was just an unfortunate situation beyond his control, pissed me off more than the actual request. He wasn't even owning it. He was hiding behind Jennifer's parents like he had no agency in his own wedding, like he was just a passenger in his own life. I asked him point blank if he was going to let them do this, if he was really going to ban his brother from his wedding, because some rich people thought my job was icky. He didn't answer at first, just kept looking at his hands. Then he said that he understood why I was upset, but I had to understand his position. Jennifer was the love of his life. Her family's money and connections could set them up for a really comfortable future. He couldn't afford to make waves right now. I asked him if he remembered who paid for his college, who raised him after our parents died, who sacrificed years of his own life to make sure Daniel had opportunities. He had the audacity to say that he was grateful for all that. But this was different. This was about his future with Jennifer, and he needed me to be supportive. Supportive. He needed me to be supportive of him excluding me from the most important day of his life because I have an honest job that makes rich people uncomfortable. I actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, the kind of laugh you do when something is so absurd you can't process it any other way. I told Daniel he had a choice to make. He could tell Jennifer's parents to shove their demands where the sun doesn't shine and invite his brother to his wedding like a normal person. Or he could go ahead with their plan, but he should know that if he did, he was choosing them over me. Not just for the wedding, for everything that came after. He couldn't have it both ways. He looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was the one making this difficult. He said I was putting him in an impossible position, that I was being selfish by not understanding what he was up against. He actually said that I was being selfish. The guy whose college education I paid for called me selfish for not wanting to be excluded from his wedding. I stood up and walked to my front door, opened it, told him to get out. He tried to argue, to explain more about Jennifer's parents' concerns, but I cut him off. I said I didn't want to hear it. If he chose to uninvite me from his wedding, then as far as I was concerned, he wouldn't have a brother anymore. Not because I was being petty, but because what he was asking me to accept was fundamentally disrespectful to everything I'd done for him and everything I was as a person. Daniel left. I didn't hear from him for 2 weeks. Then I got a text message. Not a call, a text. It said that he'd thought about it, and while he appreciated everything I'd done for him over the years, he had to prioritize his relationship with Jennifer. Her parents' wishes were important to their future. He hoped I could understand, and that maybe we could reconnect after things settled down. He didn't want hard feelings between us. I read that text 3 times. Each time, I got angrier. This wasn't a difficult decision he'd struggled with. He'd made his choice the moment he walked into my house. He just needed those 2 weeks to convince himself he was justified in making it. The text was his way of clearing his conscience. Now he could tell himself he'd tried, and it was my fault for not being understanding enough. I didn't respond to the text, didn't call him, just deleted it and went back to work. If Daniel wanted to choose people who valued him for his potential connections over the person who'd actually been there for him when it mattered, that was his business. I wasn't going to beg to be included in my own brother's life. The wedding was scheduled for April 18th. I knew this because Daniel had sent out save the dates months earlier, before the whole mess. I'd stuck mine on my fridge and had marked my calendar. Now that date just served as a reminder of how quickly family loyalty could be sacrificed for social status. I went about my business, conducted funerals, met with grieving families, improved my chapel's sound system, hired a new administrative assistant, trained my apprentice on proper embalming techniques. Life continued. I wasn't sitting around moping about Daniel's decision. I was genuinely too busy. And honestly, once the initial anger faded, I felt more disappointed than hurt. Disappointed that he'd turned out to be the kind of person who'd cave to social pressure that easily. About a month before the wedding, I got a call from Daniel's friend Kevin. Kevin and I had always gotten along well. He was going to be one of Daniel's groomsmen. Kevin started the conversation by saying he'd heard about what happened and thought it was completely messed up. He wanted me to know that not everyone in Daniel's life agreed with the decision. I appreciated that, but I wasn't sure why he was calling. Kevin then explained that he'd been having conversations with a few other people in Daniel's life, friends from college, our cousin Brett, who lived in California, even Daniel's boss, who'd known our family situation. They were all pretty disgusted by what Daniel was doing. Kevin had been appointed as the spokesperson to let me know that there was a group of people who wanted to make a statement at the wedding. I asked what kind of statement he was talking about. Kevin said they were thinking of boycotting the wedding or standing up during the ceremony to call out Daniel and Jennifer's parents for their elitist garbage. Basically, they wanted to cause a scene to defend my honor. I told Kevin I appreciated the support, but no, that wasn't the move. Causing drama at Daniel's wedding wouldn't accomplish anything except making everyone look bad and giving Jennifer's parents exactly the ammunition they'd need to justify their decision. They'd just point to the disruption and say, "See, this is why we didn't want his family there." Kevin understood, but said he still wanted to do something. I told him the best thing he could do was just be there as Daniel's friend and support his marriage, even if the circumstances around the wedding sucked. This wasn't Kevin's fight, and I didn't want him burning bridges with Daniel on my account. We ended the call on good terms. But our conversation got me thinking. Daniel had made his choice, and I'd made mine. But there was a part of me that wanted him to understand the weight of what he'd done. Not in a dramatic blow-up kind of way. I'm not about that life. But I wanted him to feel, just for a moment, the same dismissal and disrespect he'd shown me. I spent the next few weeks considering different approaches. I could write him a letter explaining everything he'd given up for appearances. I could show up at the wedding anyway and force a confrontation. I could put a note in the gift box if I sent one, laying out exactly how I felt. None of these options felt right. They were all too direct, too obvious, too much like I was trying to hurt him. Then about 3 weeks before the wedding, I was conducting a service for an elderly gentleman named Robert Chen. Robert had been a World War II veteran, a Bronze Star recipient, and a pillar of his community. His family had requested a military honor guard for the graveside service. I'd coordinated with the local VFW post to arrange it. At the service, I watched the honor guard perform their duties with such precision and respect. The folding of the flag, the presentation to Robert's widow, the rifle salute, the playing of taps. It was beautiful and heartbreaking and dignified all at once. Robert's widow clutched that folded flag like it was the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. It represented a lifetime of service and sacrifice. As I watched her, something clicked in my mind. My job wasn't just about dead bodies and embalming fluid and selling caskets. It was about honoring people's lives and service. It was about recognizing sacrifice. It was about bearing witness to what someone had meant to the people who loved them. And suddenly, I knew exactly how to handle Daniel's wedding. I went back to my office after Robert's service and pulled up my calendar. April 18th, Daniel's wedding day. I checked my schedule, and as luck would have it, I had a funeral service booked that morning. The family had specifically requested a 10 a.m. service because the deceased had been an early riser who loved mornings. Daniel's wedding ceremony wasn't until 4 p.m. at the vineyard. I made a phone call to the family I'd be serving that day, explained that I had a personal commitment in the afternoon, and asked if they'd be comfortable with my senior apprentice handling the graveside portion of the service while I managed the chapel service and preparation. They knew my apprentice, trusted him, and agreed without hesitation. Then I made another call to a colleague I'd gone to mortuary school with. His name was Christopher, and he ran a funeral home about 40 minutes from Portland. I asked him if he'd ever heard of funeral crashers. He laughed and said no, that wasn't a thing. I told him I was about to make it a thing, and I needed his help. Christopher listened to my whole story. Daniel, the education I'd paid for, the wedding ban, all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said 3 words I'll never forget. Let's do this. See, Christopher had something I needed access to. A pristine 1947 Cadillac hearse. Not some beat-up horror movie prop. A fully restored, gleaming black professional hearse that he used for vintage funeral services when families requested it. The thing was beautiful. Chrome in perfect condition, original leather interior, ran like a dream. It was Christopher's pride and joy. I explained my plan. Christopher would lend me the hearse for the afternoon of April 18th. I'd drive it to Daniel's wedding venue and park it in the most visible spot possible. I wouldn't crash the ceremony. I wouldn't make a scene. I'd just be there, in my full funeral director attire, standing next to a vintage hearse, as a living reminder of the job Daniel was so ashamed of. The job that made his entire life possible. Christopher loved it, said it was the most poetic thing he'd heard all year. He immediately agreed to lend me the hearse and even offered to come with me as backup if things got weird. I declined the backup but accepted the hearse. We set up a time for me to pick it up on the morning of the 18th. The next 2.5 weeks crawled by. I didn't reach out to Daniel. He didn't contact me. The silence between us felt appropriate somehow. We'd both made our positions clear, and there was nothing left to say. I focused on work, took my dog for long walks, and tried not to think too much about what I was planning. The night before the wedding, I barely slept. Not because I was nervous exactly, but because my brain wouldn't shut off. I kept running through scenarios. What if security stopped me? What if Daniel had told the venue to watch for me? What if Jennifer's parents confronted me? I didn't have answers to these questions, but I also didn't really care. I was going to do this regardless. April 18th arrived with perfect spring weather. Sunny, about 70 degrees, light breeze. The kind of day that makes you understand why people get married in April. My morning funeral service went smoothly. The family was kind and grateful. My apprentice handled his portion of the service professionally. By noon, I was done with my professional obligations and could focus on my personal mission. I drove to Christopher's funeral home and picked up the hearse. He detailed it the day before. The thing was absolutely flawless. As I drove it back toward Portland, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. This vehicle, designed to carry the dead to their final rest, was going to deliver a very different kind of message today. I stopped at my house and changed into my full professional attire. Black suit, white shirt, conservative tie, polished shoes. I looked exactly like what I was, a funeral director ready to work. I checked my appearance in the mirror, smoothed down my hair, and headed out. The vineyard where Daniel was getting married was about 30 minutes outside Portland. Fancy place with rolling hills, elegant buildings, and probably a price tag that made my eyes water. I'd looked it up online. Their cheapest wedding package started at 15 grand. Jennifer's parents had clearly spared no expense. I arrived at the venue around 3 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled for 4, which meant guests would be arriving any minute. I parked the hearse right in front of the main building, in a spot that was technically for loading and unloading but was the most visible location possible. Anyone driving up to the venue would see it immediately. I got out, straightened my suit jacket, and leaned against the hearse's hood. Then I waited. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't skulking around. I was just standing there in broad daylight next to a vintage hearse, looking exactly like a funeral director on a call. The first guests started arriving around 3:15. I watched their faces as they drove up and spotted the hearse. The confusion, the double takes, the whispered conversations through car windows. A few people parked and walked toward the entrance, shooting glances back at me in the hearse like they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Around 3:30, I saw Kevin pull up in his car. He recognized me immediately, and his face split into this huge grin. He parked, walked over, and just started laughing. Told me this was the most brilliant thing he'd ever seen. I shrugged and said I was just here representing my profession. Kevin asked if I was planning to go inside. I said no. I was exactly where I needed to be. More guests arrived. The whispers got louder. People were clearly confused about why there was a hearse at a wedding. Some probably thought someone had died. Others maybe thought it was some weird wedding transportation trend. A few looked at me, saw my professional demeanor, and seemed to put together that this wasn't official wedding business. At 3:45, Jennifer's mother came rushing out of the main building. She was exactly what I'd pictured. Perfectly styled hair, expensive dress, expression that could freeze nitrogen. She marched straight up to me and demanded to know what I thought I was doing. I replied calmly that I was parked in a public space and wasn't disrupting anything. She said this was a private event, and I needed to leave immediately. I pointed out that I was on the access road to the venue, not on private property. I'd checked the property lines that morning. Technically, I was within my rights to be there. She turned red and said she was calling security. I told her that was absolutely her right, but they'd find the same thing I just told her. Then she switched tactics and asked if I was trying to ruin her daughter's wedding. I said I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I was simply present, doing nothing illegal, bothering no one. Jennifer's mother looked like she wanted to explode, but before she could respond, I saw Daniel coming out of the building. He was in his tux, looking stressed as hell. He spotted me, spotted the hearse, and stopped dead in his tracks. His face went completely white. We locked eyes across the parking area. I didn't move, didn't smile, didn't wave, just stood there, calm and composed, next to the gleaming black Cadillac hearse that represented everything he was ashamed of, everything he'd tried to hide from his new family. Daniel started walking toward me. Jennifer's mother tried to stop him, grabbing his arm, but he shook her off. He covered the distance between us quickly, and for a second, I thought he might actually take a swing at me, but he didn't. He just stood there, about 5 feet away, staring. He asked what the hell I was doing. I replied that I was attending his wedding. He said I wasn't invited. I agreed. He'd made that very clear. But I never said I wasn't coming. I told him I just wouldn't be inside. I'd be right here instead. A visible reminder of exactly what he'd sacrificed for his new in-laws' approval. Daniel's jaw worked like he was trying to find words, but nothing came out. I continued, keeping my voice level and calm. I told him this hearse represented 12 years of my life, the same 12 years that paid for his education, kept him fed and housed, and gave him every opportunity he had. If he was ashamed of it, that was his problem. But I wasn't going to pretend it didn't exist. He said I was being petty and trying to embarrass him. I corrected him. He'd embarrassed himself by letting people who'd known him for 2 years matter more than someone who'd raised him. I wasn't doing anything except standing here in my professional capacity. If that embarrassed him, maybe he should ask himself why. More guests were arriving now. Some were definitely watching us. Daniel noticed and looked panicked. He said Jennifer's parents were threatening to cancel the wedding if I didn't leave. I told him that was their choice to make. I wasn't on their property. I wasn't causing a disturbance. I was just existing in a space I had every right to occupy. Daniel begged me to just go, said we could talk about this later, after the wedding, but please just leave so he could get married without drama. I asked him what he thought would happen after. Did he think I'd just forget about this? That we'd go back to being brothers, after he'd shown me exactly how little I meant to him? He didn't answer, just stood there looking defeated. Jennifer's mother was yelling something from the entrance, probably for him to get back inside. The ceremony was supposed to start in 10 minutes. I told Daniel I'd stay for exactly 1 hour. I'd stand here with my hearse and then I'd leave. That would give him plenty of time to get through his ceremony without my presence inside. But every guest arriving late would see me. Every guest taking photos outside would have to work around me. And he'd know, for the rest of his life, that on his wedding day, the brother he'd banned showed up anyway in the one way he couldn't prevent. Daniel looked like he might cry. He said I was ruining the happiest day of his life. I replied that he'd already done that himself when he chose to exclude me. This was just making sure he understood the weight of that decision. He turned and walked back toward the building without another word. Jennifer's mother was waiting for him, and I could see her gesturing angrily in my direction. But they both went inside. The ceremony would proceed as planned, just with a vintage hearse and a funeral director parked in full view of everyone attending. I stayed there for my promised hour, watched guests arrive, do double takes, whisper to each other. Some looked amused, others looked confused, a few looked angry. I didn't care. I maintained my professional composure the entire time, answering the occasional question from curious guests who asked if there had been a death. I'd simply say no. I was here in a personal capacity, and left it at that. At exactly 4:45, I got back in the hearse and drove away. I'd made my point. Daniel would have to live with the knowledge that he couldn't fully erase me from his wedding day, no matter how hard he tried. The job he was ashamed of, the job that made his entire adult life possible, had literally shown up in the most visible way imaginable. I returned the hearse to Christopher, who was thrilled to hear how everything went down. He said I'd use the hearse for its highest possible purpose, delivering a dead relationship to its final resting place. We both appreciated the metaphor. I went home, changed out of my suit, and tried to decompress. My phone started blowing up around 6 p.m. Texts from Daniel. Voicemails from Daniel. Texts from numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored all of it. Finally, around 8 p.m., I listened to one of Daniel's voicemails. His voice was shaking. He said the wedding had been a disaster. Jennifer's parents had been furious. Half the guests spent the cocktail hour talking about the mysterious hearse. Jennifer was upset. Her mother was threatening to cut them off financially. Everything was ruined, and it was all my fault. I deleted the voicemail. He called again at 9 p.m., then 10 p.m., then midnight. Each time, I sent it to voicemail. Around 1 a.m., he sent a text saying he needed to talk to me urgently, that we needed to fix this, that he was sorry and wanted to explain. I didn't respond to that either. The texts and calls continued for 3 days. Daniel was panicking. Apparently, Jennifer's parents had completely cut off the financial support they'd promised the newlyweds. The honeymoon they were supposed to take to Italy was canceled. Jennifer was barely speaking to him because she blamed him for not handling his family better. His perfect wedding had imploded, and he was desperate to fix it. On day 4, he showed up at my funeral home. My assistant told him I was with a family and couldn't be disturbed. He said he'd wait. I let him sit there for 2 hours before I finally agreed to see him in my office. Daniel looked terrible. Hadn't shaved, eyes were red, looked like he hadn't slept. He started talking immediately, words tumbling out in a rush. He said he'd made a huge mistake, that he should never have listened to Jennifer's parents, that he'd been so focused on impressing them and securing his future that he'd forgotten what actually mattered. He said he was sorry and needed me to help him fix things. I asked him what exactly he wanted me to fix. He said Jennifer's parents were threatening divorce if they didn't get the wedding problem resolved. They wanted me to apologize publicly to them for disrupting the wedding. They wanted assurances that I wouldn't be involved in future family events. They wanted Daniel to promise he'd keep me at a distance. And Daniel wanted to know if I'd be willing to do that to help him save his marriage. I sat there for a solid minute, just looking at him. Then I asked if he understood how fundamentally insane what he was requesting was. He'd excluded me from his wedding because his in-laws thought my profession was embarrassing. I'd shown up anyway, in a completely legal and non-disruptive way, to make a point about that exclusion. And now he wanted me to apologize to the people who demanded I be excluded in the first place, and promised to continue being excluded going forward, all so he could preserve his relationship with people who saw me as a problem to be managed. Daniel said I didn't understand the pressure he was under, that Jennifer was the love of his life and he couldn't lose her, that her parents' money and connections were important for their future, that he needed his brother to help him fix this mess. I told him I wasn't his brother anymore. A brother doesn't do what he did. A brother doesn't exclude you from the most important day of his life because his in-laws are snobs. A brother doesn't ask you to apologize for his own failures. I said he made his choice when he banned me from his wedding, and I made mine when I showed up in a hearse. We were done. Daniel started crying, actual tears, begging me to reconsider, saying he'd make it up to me, that he'd pay me back every penny I'd spent on his education, that he'd do anything if I'd just help him save his marriage. I asked him if Jennifer knew the full story of how he got through college, if she knew that her husband's fancy degree came from years of his brother working 60-hour weeks at a funeral home, if she understood that the person her parents found so embarrassing was the reason Daniel had any opportunities at all. He admitted he'd never told her the full story, said he'd mentioned I helped out, but not the extent of it, that it never seemed relevant. I told him it was relevant now. I stood up and opened my office door, told him we were done here and he needed to leave. He tried to argue, but I called my assistant to escort him out. She did, and I went back to work. That was 4 months ago. 2 weeks later, Daniel showed up at my house at 11 p.m. I didn't answer the door. He sat on my porch for an hour leaving voicemails about how Jennifer had moved back in with her parents and was threatening divorce, how her dad had canceled the job opportunity at his company, how everything was falling apart. I watched from my upstairs window. Eventually, he left. 3 weeks after that, I got a certified letter from Jennifer's parents' attorney threatening to sue me for emotional distress. I forwarded it to my own attorney. Never heard from them again. Month 2, Daniel started showing up at my funeral home during services, standing in the parking lot waiting for me. I had to get a restraining order after he tried to approach a grieving family. The judge granted it immediately. Around month 3, Kevin called. Daniel and Jennifer had separated officially. Jennifer filed for divorce. Daniel moved into a studio apartment and was barely holding on to his job. His manager was questioning his performance because he was constantly distracted. Kevin also mentioned the wedding had become legendary in their friend group. Most people thought the hearse was hilarious. Kevin said at least 5 people at the wedding had asked for my business card. Last week, our cousin Brett called from California. Daniel had asked him to convince me to write a letter to Jennifer, explaining the hearse thing was a misunderstanding. Brett laughed in his face. Then Brett told me half our extended family thought what I did was legendary. Yesterday, I was conducting a funeral when I spotted Daniel in the back of the chapel. He'd gotten past my staff somehow. I continued the service professionally, then had security remove him. He sent me an email 2 hours later, 15 paragraphs of apologies and desperate pleas. Jennifer had officially filed for divorce. Her parents had blackballed him in Portland's business community. He'd been demoted. He was broke, and he wanted to meet one more time for closure. I deleted it without responding. This morning, I got a text from Jennifer. She'd heard the full story about Daniel's college from someone at the wedding and wanted to apologize. She said if she'd known what I'd done for Daniel, she never would have agreed to exclude me. Daniel had minimized my role to look more self-made to her family. She also said her parents disowned her for divorcing Daniel. She asked if I'd meet for coffee. I texted back, no thanks, then blocked her number. So here's where things stand. Daniel's marriage is done. His in-laws hate him. He's barely employed, living in a studio he can't afford. His friends know he's the guy who was too embarrassed of his funeral director brother to invite him to his wedding, and he's desperate for forgiveness. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel and help us bring you more and better stories. Thanks.